For those of you who don't know me, I'm Allison Stanger. I'm director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs. I'd like to welcome you to this session of our Friday International Studies Colloquium series. If anyone's new to us here, and I do see some new faces, lunch is served throughout the program. We're very informal, so I'd encourage you to, in a quiet way, go up and get coffee or a cookie if you want one. And our speaker knows our ways, so you will not offend him. And we'll conclude promptly at 1:30. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Jeffrey Lunstead, diplomat in residence and visiting assistant professor in international studies at Middlebury. Jeff was United States ambassador to Sri Lanka and Maldives from 2003 to 2006. A member of the Foreign Service since 1977, he served overseas in a variety of posts, including Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. In Washington, he was director for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh from 1999 to 2001. And he was also Afghanistan coordinator after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. He's currently teaching international diplomacy in modern South Asia, which I've heard great things about. And he will be teaching identity and conflict in South Asia in spring semester. I think his fall semester course was definitely well received because I've already heard the spring semester course is completely closed out with a waiting list, which is always a good sign. His topic today, which you see on the screen behind you, is Big Power, Small Conflicts, the United States and the Sri Lanka Peace Process. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Lunstead.
Okay, is that working? Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Allison. I have to say, I don't do talks, but I have a few PowerPoint slides because there's some things I wanted to show you. I'm going to discuss the involvement of the U.S. and the rest of the international community in the Sri Lanka peace process from 2000 onwards. This involvement is an example of the process in the literature and in practice as liberal peace building. This could be defined as the concept that outside parties solve an internal conflict by political incentives, and that peace, economic liberalization, and growth will reinforce each other in a virtuous cycle. Now, why did I call this a small conflict? This does not mean to demean the intensity of the issue. After all, there are over 70,000 dead in Sri Lanka since 1983 because of this conflict. The country as a whole has been disrupted severely. I call it small. From the United States perspective, it is a small conflict because it has no strategic interests in Sri Lanka. There are no major issues. Sri Lanka doesn't have any oil. It's a small trade. $2 billion a year. In contrast with Malaysia, which is a country of the same size, is over 10 times larger. There's not major business interests. The U.S. is not interested in military bases in Sri Lanka. So there's no strategic interest for the U.S. In addition, you might say, well, it's a strategic interest because there's a terrorism issue. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, the Tigers for short, are a terrorist group designated by the United States. But the LTTE has never had any connection to outside groups. It's never been involved with Al-Qaeda or Islamic Jihad or any of these groups. So for the United States, it's a limited issue. The question is, what happens when the U.S. engages in such a small conflict, and the rest of the international community do this alone, in a small conflict where the U.S. doesn't have strategic interest? Can it maintain a long-term engagement? And can it have sources that would support them? Will other U.S. interests distort the policy in this conflict in an unhelpful way? And specifically in the post-September 11th environment, will a U.S. emphasis on counterterrorism in the age of the global war on terrorism lead to policies which might hinder the search for peace in Sri Lanka? And most specifically, did the U.S. hard line on the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam lead to better behavior on their part? Or did it convince them that they would be marginalized in the peace process, thereby harm the process? Also, did the U.S. and the international community, in their belief that the two sides could be motivated by economic incentives, bear out? Did a radical economic reform program strengthen or weaken support for peace? Sri Lanka is a paradox in a number of ways. It's a country with many advantages, which would make you wonder why it has deteriorated into this situation of almost constant warfare. For one thing, in the most superficial sense, it's a beautiful. It's the paradigm of the palm-fringed beaches, tea plantations. It's a wonderful place, but it's not just a pretty face. If you look, for instance, Sri Lanka's growth over the years has been its ability to bring economic and social benefits to its populace is quite outstanding. If you compare Sri Lanka to two of its neighbors in South Asia, Bangladesh and India, Sri Lanka's GDP per capita, $4,600 versus $3,700 for India, $2,200 for Bangladesh. Look at the literacy rate. Sri Lanka, 92%. That's a rate compared to 60% for India. And although it's not noted here, that's an equal literacy rate for males and females, which is quite significant. Life expectancy, 75 years, which is really almost U.S. life expectancy. And in the health field, we see really an amazing performance. Maternal mortality, which is deaths during childbirth of mothers per 100,000 births, 47 for Sri Lanka, 407 for India. So 1/10. Infant mortality, which is deaths before 1 year per 1,000 live births, 11 for Sri Lanka, 63 for India. It's 6 for the U.S. Sri Lanka is not so bad compared to the U.S. Child mortality, which is deaths before the age of 5 per 1,000. Again, we see a similar, quite dramatic advantage in Sri Lanka. So it's a country which has done very well in a number of ways. It's had a very successful political tradition, universal suffrage since the 1930s, men and women both voting in Sri Lanka, a peaceful, smooth transition to independence in 1998. It's an example of successful development in many ways. So how did this happen, that we got into this civil war? Well, part of it is it's an ethnic war, and this shows the ethnic division in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is about 74% Sinhalese. And Sinhalese, in this map, they've done two colors. It's the yellow and the orange, low country and high country. But you can see Sinhalese are concentrated in the south and center of the country. Tamils are about 18% of the country, and they are in this area around the north and then down around the east coast. In addition, Sri Lanka has a 7% Muslim population. That's quite interesting if you try to figure out what these terms mean. Sinhalese are people who speak Sinhala. They are mainly Buddhist, although there's also a small Christian Sinhalese population. Tamils speak Tamil, so they're language-defined groups, and most Tamils are Hindus, but some are Christians also. Muslims, well, wait a minute, there's a change here now. Muslims are defined by religion, but Muslims speak Tamil. So we have a cross-cutting way of dividing groups up. Muslims, by the way, are the least developed and the most marginalized group in Sri Lanka, and the one that are caught in the middle in this conflict. So what's the genesis of the conflict? Under colonialism, Tamils took advantage of education. They took to Western education, to English language education. American missionaries, in fact, founded English language schools in northern Sri Lanka by the middle of the 19th century. In fact, the grandmother of John Foster Dulles is buried in northern Sri Lanka. She was a Presbyterian missionary there. That's a trivia fact that not many people know. So the Tamils took advantage of English language education, and then they succeeded in the professions, in law, in medicine, in accounting, and in government service out of proportion to their proportion of the population. This led to some resentment on the part of the Sinhalese. 1948, Sri Lanka became independent and was ruled essentially by a very westernized elite which paid little attention to Sinhala or Tamil differences. Two parties appeared, the United National Party, the UNP, a slightly right-wing party, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, SLFP, a slightly left-wing party. But the whole pattern changed in 1956 when there was an election, and the SLFP candidate ran on an appeal to Sinhalese chauvinism. He introduced ethnic issues into Sinhalese politics. In particular, he ran on a policy. Up to this time, Sri Lanka had three official languages, Sinhala, Tamil, and English. He ran on a policy of Sinhala only, that the only language of Sri Lanka, official language, should be Sinhalese, the only language used in government should be Sinhala, and he won. Now a pattern began that policy, in this case, the Sinhala-only policy, would be a extreme policy would be proposed in an election. A party would win. After they had won the election, they would become more moderate and try to seek an accommodation. And SWRD Bandaranaike, who won the election, immediately began to try to seek an accommodation with the Tamils and pact with them. And the other party, the party that had lost, would then attack the winning party as being a traitor to the Sinhalese. And this would reverse at the next election. The other party would win on an extreme platform, then they would try to be accommodating, and the losing party would attack them. This has gained the rubric of ethnic outbidding. Each side tries to outbid the other on the ethnic issue. The Tamils then began a constitutional struggle for federalism. Sri Lanka is a unitary state, does not have a federal system. This struggle failed. Radical groups began to grow, wanting a separate state. And this is, they call it Tamil Elam, which means Tamil country. And this is a photo, a map of the area that they would claim for a separate country. In 1983, a war began when the Tigers attacked a Sri Lankan army patrol in northern Sri Lanka. In result, there was massive rioting in Colombo in which several thousand Tamils were killed, and the country has gone back and forth on war ever since then. The Tigers are a very interesting group. For one thing, they're extraordinarily competent. Not only have they fought the Sri Lankan army to a standstill for 25 years, they have a navy, they have a merchant fleet, they procure weapons throughout Southeast Asia and ship them in. They actually have what they now call an air force, which is two small crop duster planes that they brought in parts and reassembled in the north, and they fly them over Colombo once in a while, and they literally drop bombs out the cockpit window. But it's an extraordinary performance that they've done. How did we get to then the peace process, which began in 2000-2001? The SLFP, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the left-wing party, had been in control since 1994 under President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga. But the war was going very badly. The country had an economic contraction for the first time ever in 2000. And in the middle of 2000, the Tigers, who have this penchant for dramatic attacks, attacked the Colombo airport, destroyed half of the fleet of Sri Lankan airlines on the ground, and the mood in the country turned decisively against continuation of the war. The UNP leader, Ranil Wickremesinghe, won a parliamentary election on a peace plank. Now, Sri Lanka has a constitutional system which is somewhat similar to France. It's actually patterned after the French Constitution, where you have a powerful president and a prime minister. And in this case, for the first time ever, we had a president, Chandrika Kumaratunga, and a prime minister, Ranil, who were from opposite parties. And they use the same phrase as the French do. They call it cohabitation. Ranil promised to move Sri Lanka from a unitary to a federal system and to institute radical economic reforms to get the country growing. And these, Sri Lankan names, if it's less than 6 syllables, it's a short name. So we'll call Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga will just be Chandrika for short, and Ranil is Ranil. And Chandrika was elected president in 1994, re-elected in 1999. She left office in 2005, 2-term limit. Ranil was defeated by Chandrika both times, but then elected prime minister in 2001. He lost that post in 2004, and he was defeated for president in 2005. He was defeated by Mahinda Rajapaksa, who is now the president of Sri Lanka. So Ranil negotiated a ceasefire with the LTTE, and he began a series of political negotiations which were designed to bring about a federal state. And the LTTE accepted in principle the idea of a federal state rather than an independent state. And then the U.S. and the international community became engaged, heavily engaged. Why was this so? Why was the U.S., which has no strategic interest, decide to become engaged in Sri Lanka? Well, there are 3 reasons. First was, in the post-September 11, 2000 world, there was a new outlook by the U.S. that terrorism anywhere was a problem for the United States. It's also the case that the new UNP government was very pro-West, pro-globalization. It's very friendly to the Bush administration. Ranil defended the Iraq War at the UN, for instance. Very few third world leaders did that. He worked closely with the U.S. on trade talks in the Doha round, and he pursued free market reforms at home, which were very similar to the economic policies of the Bush administration. So there was a coherence of policies. But finally, the other factor was the personal interest of then Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage. And that was actually the most important one. And the question would be why? Why was Rich so interested? Well, I asked him, because nobody knew. And the reason why Rich was so interested is that he saw Sri Lanka as a model in the world of, after September 11th, of struggles against terrorism. That if the Sri Lankans could devise a peaceful solution with the support of the international community, that this would be an example for the region and indeed for the world of how to turn a terrorism issue into a political issue. So he got this personal interest. Others in the administration also became interested. U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zellick, for instance, because of the cooperation with Sri Lanka in the WTO and the Doha round. So the U.S. gave political support to this process. It promised economic development support. It gave military support, and it worked with the other members of the international community. Political support, the best example of this is that Ranil, during his short term in office, was invited to the White House for meetings with President Bush, not once but twice, in the space of 2.5 years. That's quite extraordinary. It's very hard to get a meeting in the White House for a foreign leader, and for a leader where the U.S. has no interest is extremely difficult. Chandrika was president for 11 years. She never got to the White House, and she was really jealous of Ranil for that fact. The U.S. also, and the international community, promised development assistance to the Sri Lankans, to all the Sri Lankans, to the LTTE and to the government. Well, this was one of the major planks of the peace process. June of 2003, the international community held a development and reconstruction conference in Tokyo and pledged $4.5 billion over 3 years. And they linked it to the peace process, that this money would be dispersed as long as the two sides showed they were serious moving forward on the peace process, and that there would be, although the money was entirely for all of Sri Lanka, there would be an emphasis on rebuilding the north and the east, the Tamil areas which were conflict affected and been so badly damaged during the war. Now, how do you determine the real engagement of a country, aside from words, a country like the United States, in a process like this? I mean, words are cheap. Well, the answer is you follow the money, and you see how much resources is a country willing to contribute. What was the U.S. willing to contribute toward this process? USAID had had a program in Sri Lanka since the mid-1950s. During the Cold War, of course, it was one more theater of competition with the Soviet Union, but after the Cold War, interest waned, the program was phasing down, and in fact, AID proposed closing it in the end of the 1990s. Now that idea stopped, and instead the U.S. increased its development assistance for Sri Lanka. And you can see here, this is in millions of dollars. 1999, 2000, before the process got going, it was actually on a downward trend to a very small amount, $7 million is peanuts in development assistance. And then it moved up quite substantially, up to $17 million in 2004, $16 million in 2005, before declining again. Now, there's a couple of interesting things when you look at this. First is there's a time lag. Peace process started in 2001. U.S. couldn't really get more money out until 2004. This is the result of bureaucracy and long lead times for budgets. And in fact, these are appropriations. This is not expenditures. Anyone who's ever worked with USAID knows money appropriated in 2004 will never get spent until at least 2006. So if you wanted to make a big impact, you don't do it like this. It's really a slow way to move. In addition to U.S. aid assistance, the Bush administration's major initiative in development beginning in 2000, what was called the Millennium Challenge Account. So it was going to be the new way to do assistance when it was designed to award countries with good policies, that development assistance would be given not on the basis of need, but on the basis of earning it through following proper economic and political policies. It was supposed to be objective. Countries around the world would be measured on 16 metrics under good governance, good economic policy, and dealing with their people. And then those that passed a certain level, on an objective level, would be eligible to negotiate a compact and get assistance from MCA. Sri Lanka was designated as an MCA-eligible country and began talks on a compact, and original talks on this compact were estimated at a project that would be estimated up to $500 million, which would have been, of course, a huge jump. Wasn't just the U.S., the World Bank, the IMF, and other donors supported this and supported the economic reform program that Ronald was putting forth. The U.S. also, and in this case the U.S. was different from most of the other participants in the process, decided to increase military assistance to Sri Lanka. This included training, visits by U.S. Navy ships and senior officials, and a small foreign military financing program. This is the program by which the U.S. provides funding to countries to buy military equipment directly from the U.S. Military. And we see here, again, actually, there was no FMF program in early years. And then the U.S. bumped it up fairly substantially to $2.5 million. And then it declined a bit and has sort of evened out. These are not large amounts, by any means in terms of an FMF program, but they had a symbolic meaning. And the intent was not to bolster the Sri Lankan military to return to war. The intent was to send a message to the LTTE that a return to war would be costly and that they should follow a path of political negotiations, a peaceful path. Whether that worked or not is a different issue. Now, a problem came about for the United States because the U.S. in 1997 had designated the LTTE as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO. This is under the Terrorism Act. And when you designate an organization as an FTO, it puts certain constraints on what you can do. Here are the constraints. It's unlawful for a person in the U.S. to provide funds or material support to an FTO. Representatives of an FTO are inadmissible to the U.S. They can't get a visa, although this can be waived by the Attorney General on the advice of the Secretary of State. And U.S. financial institutions must block funds of designated FTOs and their agents. Notice that there is no legal prohibition. These are the legal prohibitions. There's no prohibition on U.S. officials meeting with officials of an FTO. And in fact, once the peace process started, and the Sri Lankan government, which had called the LTTE a terrorist organization, removed that designation. They were no longer a terrorist organization. They were a partner in the peace process. So other governments and organizations, the EU, Japan, the World Bank, began a series of meetings with the LTTE to talk, for one thing, about development in LTTE areas. The U.S. did not. The U.S. decided not to meet with Tiger leaders. Now, this is a funny situation because here the U.S. is supporting a peace process which has two equal partners, but the U.S. will only meet with one of the partners. It's a very odd kind of situation to be in, but it was a result of the political atmosphere toward terrorism in that period. And a number of people in Washington have simply said it was just impossible. The U.S. couldn't go out and meet with terrorists. It was also partly to hold out a carrot, to say if the LTTE shows that it genuinely has changed its behavior, no longer commits terrorist acts, that the U.S. could remove the listing of the LTTE. That's a process that can be done by the Secretary of State. That seems like at least a logical policy, whether it's good policy or not. The question is whether the LTTE believed it. And since the U.S. wouldn't meet with the LTTE, couldn't convey that message directly. We tried to convey it through intermediaries, but again, we don't know if the LTTE ever really thought that the U.S. would remove it from the terrorism list. Another problem is the material support clause. What constituted material support? If USAID were to do development projects in Tamil areas, how would you decide if they were material support to the Tigers? Well, we asked if you have a question like this, if you're in the government and you can't resolve it easily, then you send it to the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel for an opinion. So we asked them. It took about 2 years to get an answer, and we never got a clear answer. I figured they were too busy writing memos justifying torture. This is the office of John Yoo and these other people. So anyway, the result was the U.S. couldn't do projects in Tiger areas. We didn't know if it would be legal or not, so we didn't do it. But we supported other people doing it. And the World Bank was setting up a trust fund to do projects in Tamil areas. And we supported the fund even though we wouldn't contribute to it. Another example of a split schizophrenic kind of policy. Another problem was visas. As you see, members of an FTO can't get a visa unless they get a waiver from the secretary. That's a pretty big bar. And prior to the June 2003 donor meeting in Tokyo, the U.S. hosted a preparatory meeting in Washington in May. This seemed very logical because it was held at the same time as the World Bank IMF spring meetings. All the ministers would be there. It would be easy to get them together. But, of course, the LTTE couldn't come unless they were granted a waiver. And no one wanted to take the effort to grant them a waiver. They saw this as an insult and as an indication that they were not being taken seriously as a partner in the process. Nonetheless, the U.S. worked closely with the rest of the international community. The U.S. was one of the 4 co-chairs of the Tokyo Conference, which gave it a leadership position, the U.S., the EU, Norway, and Japan. Interesting, and worked with a larger donor group, which included other bilateral donors, UN agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank. Interestingly, the country that did not play a role in this group was India. India has a strategic interest in Sri Lanka. It's right next door. It has a large Tamil population of its own, but it did not join the group, stayed outside. At any rate, the peace process faltered from 2003 onwards. The Tiger violations of the process accelerated, assassinating opponents. The Tigers declined to go to Tokyo, even though they were invited for the donor conference, and they suspended the political talks in the spring of 2003. President Kumaratunga Chandrika dismissed the Ranil Wickremesinghe government February 2004. The UNP lost the subsequent parliamentary election. Opinion polls showed that Ranil lost mainly on economic issues, not on peace issues. The U.S. side, we had a new Bush administration. Rich Armitage departed. Bob Zellick became the deputy secretary. He lost interest because his buddies were no longer in power in Sri Lanka. In fact, he became somewhat hostile to Sri Lanka. Chandrika had to leave office because of her 2-term limit. Ranil was defeated in his race for the presidency by Mahinda Rajapaksa, and the peace process began a decline and then a collapse. The LTT escalated attacks. The government of Sri Lanka responded, and the ceasefire was officially ended in January of this year. U.S. resources then declined substantially. If we go back to this slide, you can see that sliding down to a request for 2009 of $4 million. That's actually barely sustainable because if you have a $4 million program, you're going to spend half of that just on administration. And it's really on the way out, I think. The Millennium Challenge Corporation removed Sri Lanka from its list of eligible countries. Ostensibly, this was an objective decision, but at least in part, it was because the Congress was becoming increasingly aware of human rights problems in Sri Lanka as the war heated up. In the fiscal year 2009 congressional budget justification for foreign ops, this shows where Sri Lanka has fallen. The total for South Asia, the request, is $2.1 billion. Now, most of that is Pakistan, Afghanistan, $1.8 billion. But even in comparison to other smaller countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, the administration is requesting $107 million, Nepal, $38 million, Sri Lanka, $6.5 million. So clearly the U.S. is losing interest if a measure of interest is what resources are you willing to put in. Congress has also been turning against this issue as human rights violations against Tamils have increased. Congressman Leahy from Vermont is actually a leader on this because of the large Tamil population in Burlington, I guess. He's put restrictions. The Foreign Assistance Act of 2008 has restrictions on military assistance to Sri Lanka, the Leahy Amendment. And it prohibits the use of foreign military financing funds, the issuance of defense export licenses, and the sale or transfer of military equipment, unless the government of Sri Lanka met certain conditions, which are basically human rights conditions. The government has not met those conditions. However, it has an exemption that these funds can be used for equipment for maritime and air surveillance and communications. In other words, the idea is that if you're going to use something to try to cut off the Tiger weapons procurement network, that's okay, but you can't spend on other things. So in fact, the program goes forward. The U.S. now, remember, it's also illegal for anyone in the U.S. to provide funds or material support to the LTTE. And the LTTE has a very sophisticated global fundraising network, the Tamil diaspora around the world, in Canada, the U.S., Europe, Australia. Some of this fundraising is voluntary. A lot of it is coerced. Nonetheless, they make a lot of money. Some of it is done through front organizations. And in the U.S., the front organization was the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization, the TRO. Was a legal organization, a 501c3. Your contribution was tax deductible. Now, I did think, and many of us thought, that this was an area that the U.S. should work on very strongly. If people are raising money in the U.S. to buy weapons that are going to kill people, that we should take action against it. But we had this same time lag. We tried to get action early on, and we just couldn't get anybody to pay attention. Why? Well, the U.S. was focused on other terrorist groups, Islamic groups. They were trying to stop the funding to these groups. Eventually, the FBI designated a LTTE officer, and then we got some action, but it wasn't until this time, 2006. In 2006, the FBI arrested, in August, 8 persons for conspiracy to provide material support and purchase weapons. Another 4 persons were arrested a month later. In April 2007, the FBI arrested a U.S. representative of the LTTE in the United States. And in November of 2007, the Tamil Rehabilitation Organization, the TRO, was designated as an LTTE front, and its assets were frozen. Once again, we see this quite substantial time lag between policy and implementation, even more pronounced than in the development funding. So in sum, when we look back at how the U.S. engaged and what happened, I think there's some distinct elements. First is a short attention span. The U.S. got interested, and then it lost interest, even though it would have been naive to think that this was going to be a quick or smooth process. Anyone with any sense would think this would take a long time. There would be ups and downs. But as soon as it looked like it wasn't going to happen quickly and there were some problems, U.S. lost interest. There were minimal resources put into this. Those amounts that I showed you in terms of the resources the U.S. deploys in other areas, really quite small, and they declined significantly over time. There's a time lag in deploying the resources and in policy implementation, which means that your policy is not effective if you announce it one day and you do something 2 or 3 years later. There was a strong focus on terrorism and a hard line on the LTTE, which limited U.S. flexibility. The U.S. was also focused on one party in the domestic arena, the UNP and Ronald Wickremesinghe, ignored the other side for a long time. And finally, there was the issue of military support, the idea that you could get to peace through strength, and that military support would build a momentum for peace rather than a momentum for going back to war. Looking back, this doesn't seem to have been such a success. Deploying minimal resources and then cutting them back showed that the U.S. wasn't so interested. The close relationship with one domestic player meant that the others had little incentive to support the peace process and may have had an incentive to disrupt it. It's a type of ethnic outbidding. And when one side lost power, the U.S. had to rebuild a new relationship. I always tell people it's a golden rule of politics that you always have to stay on good terms with all players. And I quote the former mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, Vincent Buddy Cianci, who's just finished 64 months in federal prison, like most mayors of Providence, right? But who had a lot of pithy remarks, the best of which was, be careful whose toe you're stepping on today, because you might be kissing their butt tomorrow. The actual remark is slightly more earthy than that, but if you're going to engage in a country, you have to be involved with everybody. You can't just pick one side, and especially in a democracy, because people change. Leaders change. And if you only stick with one side, you're going to be in trouble when they do change. So what are the lessons for the big powers and the international community? I would say for the big powers, the outsiders, one lesson is you have to take the long view. Part of that is you have to commit sufficient resources over a long period of time, and you have to remain committed through ups and downs. You can't let a setback deter you. And you shouldn't overestimate your leverage. Parties, whatever party, won't give in on existential issues. And what I mean by existential issues is an issue that they think will mean the end of their power or their position. This is true between countries, and it's true within countries. There's a great exaggeration, in my view, of the power of the United States or anyone else to force someone to do something. They won't do it if it means the end of their position, because what's the point? You're gone. You haven't gained anything. So parties don't give in on existential issues, and economic incentives, turns out, have a very limited value. We really thought if we deployed all this money to Sri Lanka, the $4.5 billion, it's a lot of money for a small country, that this would incentivize the two sides, especially the tigers, to cooperate in the peace process. It turned out when economic issues and political issues came in conflict, the political always won. They didn't care about the money if it threatened their political status. So economic incentives have some, but very limited value. And finally, as I said before, don't ignore domestic politics. You can't rely on only one party or personality. What are the lessons for small countries? I mean, what if the international community comes to you and says, we're going to help you solve your problem? Well, I think that small countries have some lessons too. One is that you should take advantage of big power support when it's offered, because it may not last. Once it's gone, it's very hard to bring back. I don't think we can put the Sri Lankan peace process back together again in the same format that it was before, with the same amount of money that was promised at that time. Not just the U.S., but others. The Europeans have moved their money to other places. They say they're giving assistance to the poorest of the poor. Sri Lanka is not a poorest of the poor country. We saw that. The only reason they promised that assistance was to get this peace process moving. It didn't work. They pulled it out, and they're not going to bring it back. Another is that be aware, if you're a small country, your interests may be subsumed under other big power interests, as their interest in dealing with the LTTE was subsumed in a way by the U.S. global terrorism issues and policies and the inability of the U.S. to deal with this. One other one, which I actually don't have on this slide because I just added it this morning, is that trying to do, if you're a small country, trying to do too many things at once can be a big problem. If you're trying to have a peace process which is going to totally change the political system of the country, and at the same time you're going to carry out dramatic, radical economic reforms, it can be too much for people to take at once. You can threaten one part of their psyche, but if you threaten two parts at once, it's a lot, and then when you have an election, you're likely to lose. A final point that I'd like to make is that international support for this peace process, or for most, is based on the assumption that there's no option of secession, that it's a process which is designed to operate within the territorial integrity and the unity of Sri Lanka. And that's not surprising. That's the default position of the international state system. That's what states generally hold. But I thought about this when I was teaching this issue in J-term last year, and after class, a student asked me, he said, we'd gone through all this, and he said, I just don't understand. Why don't they just let the Tamils have their state? And I realized that for an outsider, not familiar with the issue, the long history of Tamil grievances, seemed like a perfectly reasonable proposal. Now, in fact, there are a number of reasons why I think it's not such a great idea, but that's a different issue. But this past summer, of course, the U.S. and others in the international community suddenly changed their default position and recognized Kosovo as an independent state. This caused quite a stir in Sri Lanka. Probably more attention paid in Sri Lanka than any place else except in the Balkans. The government denounced this, unsurprisingly. The LTT welcomed it as a model of what could happen in Sri Lanka. So it struck me that we might ask the question, under what conditions does the international community abandon its usual stand on secession and the creation of new states and come out in favor of a new state? And is it possible that Sri Lanka might at some stage come to that point? What would it take for that to happen? But that's the subject for another talk. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question specifically about the implications of big powers. This was a wonderful talk, and I learned a ton from it. But when I look at that issue, I'm wondering what I should take away for the future of American foreign policy in its involvement with small conflicts. I mean, you described the sad state of affairs with short attention span, this fluctuating funding, the huge time lags and obstacles to getting anything done. Is the implication we should draw from that the United States is ill-equipped to be meddling in these things?
It's a problem. I think the U.S. is ill-equipped because it doesn't move quickly, and especially when this is a personalized issue. The answer is, not that you shouldn't do it, but if you're going to do it, you should do it in the right way. And there are things that you can do. But that will require an effort. And it will require some reform, for instance, of the aid bureaucracy. Well, that's on the agenda anyway, I think, these days. But there are things you can do. It doesn't mean you withdraw, but you have to do it better, but you also have to think about the policy implications of what you're doing, and are you really going to be able to make this a coherent policy? Michael?
Related to Allison's question, could you go back one slide?
Sure.
To the big powers. I couldn't help thinking about the Iraq conflict.
Yeah.
And
You wonder why we couldn't get resources, right?
Well, I looked at those points, and I thought, are the lessons any different?
I was thinking of this as I prepared this, that this was about big powers and small conflicts, but actually some of the lessons are just as applicable to big conflicts, except it's harder to get things done for smaller conflicts. But the time lag, we've all seen this, for instance, on Iraq and Afghanistan, where, and this is where people are misled. They say, well, the Congress has appropriated X tens of millions or hundreds of millions or billions of dollars for development assistance. But no one, or very rarely do people actually say, well, what's the spend rate here? How much of this has actually been spent? And when you look at it, you find that often a year later, 10% has been spent. So of course you don't get the impact that you could have otherwise. There are some exceptions to this. AID, for instance, and I couldn't go into all the details, has an office called the Office of Transition Initiatives. And they had an operation in Sri Lanka. They get out there and spend the money. They have a checkbook, essentially. They have an open checkbook, and they go out, and their whole reason for being is quick impact in conflict situations. And they get out there and spend money to create facts on the ground to convince people that their future is better in a peaceful situation than a warlike situation. So there are things you can do.
Well, I began thinking about that as soon as you said that we saw it as a potential model for peacemaking. And it sounded awfully like a model for bringing democracy to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at the second half of your slide and thinking about the implications that has.
Sure, for the Middle East. Yeah. Well, it's. I mean, if you practice foreign policy, this issue of existential issues. I don't know how many times wherever you go, people will say, "Why doesn't the U.S. make Israel do X?" Why? Because it's an existential issue. Can't people grow or some other country? But the Israel one is very common. The U.S. and Israel are close. It's a small country. It's dependent on you. Blah blah blah. Can't you make Israel do this, the following? No. The answer is you can't make them. You could, if you can convince them it's in their best interests, then they might do it. But you can't make them do something they see as an existential issue, as against their interest. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Student. We have any students? You had a question? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Quick question. I was wondering what the situation was on the ground that enabled the candidate in 1956 to so-called Iraq proclamation.
Well, it was as I said, it was a situation where the country was going through a transition from rule by a westernized elite to a more indigenous governing elite, discarding the elite that had been sort of handed over by the British. And I think it was pure self-serving political gain that this one leader, S.W.R.D. Bundaranayke, saw that this was an issue that he could use to mobilize popular sentiment. And he could mobilize, since Sinhalese are 74% of the population, if you mobilize the Sinhalese, then you win. And that's what he did. And then that created a cascade, the Sinhala-only law, and at the same time, the education system was changed so that they have two education systems in Sri Lanka, a Sinhalese system and a Tamil system. So Sinhalese go to Sinhala schools, Tamils go to Tamil schools. They never meet each other in school. It's a recipe for disaster and for misunderstanding.
And
Before that, they went together, and they studied frequently in English medium.
well, that was the gist of my question was that you get into the interstices of that, how that actually was able to happen. But it sounds as though that this individual simply created that.
Well, I would say he both created it and he tapped into a potential well of resentment because of the greater success of Tamils and the resentment of that by Sinhalese, who wanted to get better position in which they saw. It's more complicated because they see it as their country and Tamils as interlopers, and they see it as Sri Lanka as the defendant of Buddhism, of pure Buddhism, in a hostile world. To simplify. All right.
Jeff, are there objective criteria for the designation of a terror organization?
Yes. Yeah.
How do you get into the Civil War freedom fighters?
Yeah, well, there are objective criteria, but in fact the designations are political. Okay? This act, the Foreign Terrorism Act, became law in 1997. First designations were made then, and they are eternally controversial as to what groups are on and what groups are off. The IRA was never put on the terrorism list, for instance. The real IRA is on. That's, a splinter group, but the IRA was not. Why? Because the U.S. was trying to encourage the political process. There's also a political issue in the United States. Designating the Tigers was essentially, as far as I can tell, a gift to the government of Sri Lanka with no political ramifications in the United States, or very little, especially at that time. Actually, the interesting thing is there's two criteria for getting on the FTO list. One is that you have to commit terrorist acts. The other is that you have to threaten U.S. interests. Now, in fact, the LTE doesn't threaten U.S. interests. The LTT has never attacked any United States interest, has been careful to avoid them, in fact. So it's actually a real stretch. There are many, many groups around the world. There's only, well, I can't remember. The number of groups on the list is quite small. It's less than 40 around the world. And there are many horrible groups which could go on the list and are not on. Why? Because they don't threaten U.S. interests, basically. So it's a political, there are objective criteria, but it's largely a political decision.
This is a conflict that's been written about in ways that challenge the assumptions of sort of rational, self-interested behavior on the part of the people in conflict here. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the nature of the ethnic and religious dimensions of this conflict,
Well,
and how susceptible they are to the
right. It does not seem rational because first, solution is actually pretty simple. Any political science professor could draw it up. You know, it's a federal state with devolution of power. But what's happened is that there's been a growth of, well, it's very complicated, of course, but there's been a conflation of Buddhist nationalism and Sinhala people, Sinhala ethnic group, which have been merged by political and religious leaders over the years and put in opposition to Tamils, who I said are seen as interlopers. This is in fact not true. Both these groups have been in Sri Lanka for considerable length of time, well over 1,000 years, and in fact, in earlier years, the boundaries between them were quite fluid. People would move back and forth. The anthropologist Gananath Obersekera has explored this extensively and shown how in medieval times there was considerable interchange in marriage and other ways between Tamils and Sinhalese. But as a result of some of the policies of the colonial power, plus the feeling, as I mentioned, among Sinhalese Buddhists that they are a beleaguered minority. They see themselves as a majority in Sri Lanka, but a minority in the world, especially with huge Hindu India looming over their shoulder, so to speak. So they feel that they are defending a heritage. Federalism is the F word in Sri Lanka. It's quite amazing. It's considered a dirty word, an insult by Sinhalese nationalists, that you cannot break the state up into smaller constituent parts. That will be the inevitable step toward secession and the disintegration of the state, which they consider to be the home of Sinhalese Buddhists, the whole country.
In your opinion, what do you think the differences would be in Sri Lanka today if the U.S. had never put a nickel into it and not been involved over the last 15, 20 years?
Probably nothing. Yeah, because from 1983 to 2001, the U.S. had very little engagement in the peace process. It was left to India. The U.S. became engaged in 2001, but in the end, we didn't. This goes back to the existential issues thing. Or another way that I put it is, and it's for the U.S. and the whole international community, we can't want it more than they do. In a way, the international community was more committed to a peaceful solution than the Sri Lankans were. And in the end, if they don't decide that they want it, it's not going to happen. It's their problem. It's their country. It has to be their solution. If they want to do it, then the international community can play a very important role in supporting that and moving it forward in many different ways. But without that, once that broke down, it just didn't work.
I've been reading in the news the last week and a half, the Sri Lankan army, they don't let anyone in there to know if it's true or not, but they say that they have cut off supplies to the Jaffna Peninsula and that they're making significant gains against the Tamil Tigers, which presents a situation where maybe there isn't a peace process anymore if the military can just take over. But what situation would that present? You have with the central government and a small minority of Tamils.
Yeah, well, there's two aspects to this. One, the government has, in fact, been very successful militarily since the breakdown of the ceasefire, much to everyone's surprise, and has at least the possibility of, in the conventional sense, defeating the Tiger military. However, the Tiger military, which is very flexible and resourceful, will simply melt away into the jungles and still continue to carry out attacks, suicide attacks, and other kinds of attacks. That's part of it. The other part of it is that this military strategy is not matched by a political strategy. Tamil grievances will still exist. There will still be no redress of them, so there's no political solution that's on the table. If the government, at the same time as it were trying a military offensive, also put out a realistic and radical political proposal to change the way the country is governed, then they would have a very good chance of bringing a vast majority of Tamils onto their side. And why do Tamils support the Tigers? Because they don't see an option. They don't see a place for them in Sri Lankan society. If they did see a place, they would, I think, quickly move toward the peace side. Tamils were the strongest supporters of the peace process. We have opinion polling from that time. They were very strong supporters of the process. They would be again. The Colombo area is a population of about 2 million. A third of that population is Tamil. Why do they live in Colombo? They live in peace with their neighbors because they don't want to live under Tiger control. But they're not being offered anything in a political sense.
We are out of time,
Okay.
but this has been wonderful, so please join me.